I still remember the first time I laid eyes on Ramu. It was a photo, grainy and dimly lit, sent in an email that had circulated among the volunteers before we ever saw him in person. He looked like a ghost of what an elephant should be. Sunken cheeks, protruding ribs, tattered ears. His eyes held that hollow look, not just of pain, but of time endured. A quiet suffering that had gone unacknowledged for decades. Back then, I had only been volunteering at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center attached to our city zoo for about a year. I came on weekends, cleaned enclosures, prepped food, attended workshops. I never imagined I would become part of something like this, a rescue story that would change not only the life of an animal, but the perspective of everyone who knew him. Ramu had been rescued from a traveling circus in the outskirts of Rajasthan, India. He was estimated to be around 45 years old at the time, though records were scarce. From what we later pieced together, he'd been captured as a calf, likely orphaned during a forest clearing operation decades ago. Sold to a wildlife trader, then to the circus. What followed was nearly 4 decades of chains, beatings, and forced performances. It took a combined effort from animal welfare organizations, undercover investigators, and legal authorities to finally free him. The circus had kept him chained by all 4 legs, often under a tin shed with barely enough room to turn around. He was made to perform tricks, wave with his trunk, and balance on small stools. The scars on his ankles told their own story. So did the abscesses on his hips, the infection behind his left eye, and the general state of his frame. He was severely emaciated, his back had a visible sway, and he had trouble walking. When he was brought to the Wildlife Rescue and Care Center, they had to use a modified crane to offload him. He was too weak to step down from the transport truck on his own. The vet team was ready: fluids, antibiotics, nutrition plan, wound dressings. But no one was prepared for how he would respond emotionally. He didn't trumpet, didn't cry out. He just stood there, still, as if waiting for the next command, the next whip. The next 6 months were critical. I wasn't there for the first few weeks of his arrival, but I read every report, every update posted by the on-site team. He refused to eat solid food. He barely moved. They placed soft bedding beneath him in a large shaded paddock away from other animals. He flinched when approached, even gently. It took over a week before he accepted a fruit from a caregiver's hand. When I finally saw him in person, it was a humid morning in June. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and disinfectant. I had been assigned to assist with preparing his food and cleaning his temporary enclosure. At that point, he was strong enough to stand and had begun walking short distances. But it was clear that his recovery was going to be as much psychological as physical. I remember standing at the fence, watching him move toward a pile of hay and boiled rice that had been mixed with chopped fruits and vitamins. He sniffed at it, nudged it with his trunk, then slowly began to eat. I was captivated. There was something so deliberate about his movements, as if every action had weight, memory. It was the first time I truly understood what it meant to witness trauma in a non-human being. Over the following year, I volunteered more frequently. Sometimes just to be around him. Ramu had started responding to his caretakers, albeit cautiously. He learned to recognize familiar voices. There was one keeper in particular, Shankar, who had a unique bond with him. Shankar had grown up near Kaziranga National Park and had worked with elephants for over 20 years. His approach was quiet, patient. No commands, no prodding. Just presence. It was under Shankar's guidance that Ramu began participating in enrichment activities, slow walks, mud baths, interaction with logs and hanging feeders. His wounds had mostly healed by then, though he still favored one side when walking, likely due to an old fracture that had never been properly set. The staff also consulted international elephant rehabilitation experts, who recommended a multi-phase recovery plan. It included physical therapy, a customized diet, controlled exposure to natural environments, and eventually, socialization with other elephants, if he was ready. That last part was delicate. Some rescued elephants never adapt well to herds after long isolation. By the end of the second year, Ramu had transformed. He had gained nearly 1,000 kilograms, his skin no longer sagged, and he had developed a deep affection for bananas, the riper, the better. His enclosure was expanded to include a mud wallow, a shallow pool, and shaded platforms. And though he still didn't trumpet often, he had begun vocalizing in low rumbles, especially in the presence of Shankar. There were moments, little flashes, that told us something inside him was healing. One morning, I saw him reach out to touch a bird that had landed near his food trough. He didn't chase it away. Just watched it, his trunk gently hovering above. Another time, during a bath, he leaned into the hose spray, closing his eyes. It was play, tentative and new, but play nonetheless. There was a collective sense among all of us that he was ready for the next step. The question was, where? Our zoo, which had undergone recent renovations and adopted a welfare-first philosophy, offered to take Ramu in as part of a sanctuary-style program. It wasn't a typical zoo setup. The elephant habitat had been redesigned to mimic a semi-wild environment, acres of open space, natural foliage, trees, enrichment stations, water bodies, and minimal public access. The staff was trained in positive reinforcement techniques, and the philosophy was centered around long-term care, not exhibition. The decision took months of planning. Transporting a full-grown elephant over 800 kilometers was no small feat. Veterinary checks, travel permits, sedation protocols, enclosure preparation, every detail had to be precise. And of course, there was the question of how Ramu would handle it. I was fortunate to be part of the advance team that would accompany him on the journey. We spent weeks acclimating him to the transport crate, a massive steel and wood structure padded inside. He was led in with food, then back out, repeatedly, until he no longer hesitated. The day of the move, we began before dawn. Ramu was surprisingly calm. Shankar walked beside him the whole way to the truck, murmuring words only they seemed to understand. Once inside, Ramu stood, not restless, just observant. I sat in a smaller vehicle trailing behind, constantly checking the live camera feed from inside the crate. He barely shifted during the 12-hour drive. When we arrived, it was dusk. The habitat glowed under the setting sun, and the scent of trees and earth seemed to welcome him. The gates opened. Shankar gave a soft call. Ramu stepped down, slowly, with that same deliberate grace, and walked into his new home. He paused under a neem tree and stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then, in a moment I'll never forget, he raised his trunk and let out a deep, resonant rumble. Not a call of distress. Not confusion. It was something else. A sound of arrival. Of beginning again. We didn't cry, not right away. We just stood there, hands clasped, knowing something extraordinary had happened. That was the beginning of Ramu's second life. A life of rest, safety, and dignity. And while that might sound like the happy ending, it wasn't the end at all. It was only the beginning of the most unexpected chapter yet. After the transport truck pulled away and the staff quietly dispersed, I stayed behind at the edge of the viewing platform, still watching Ramu beneath the neem tree. The sun had dipped fully below the horizon, and the cicadas had begun their nightly chorus. He didn't move much that first evening. He stood, facing the open space ahead, the twilight dancing on the folds of his thick skin. I remember thinking, he looks like he belongs here already. The following weeks were carefully orchestrated. The zoo's elephant habitat had been designed with multiple zones, large grassy fields, shaded groves, a shallow lake, mud wallows, and even a hillock that offered a view of the surrounding enclosure. But Ramu was not rushed to explore all of it. We began with a smaller, fully enclosed paddock near the veterinary center, where he could become familiar with the smells, sounds, and rhythms of the place. Shankar stayed in the staff quarters adjacent to the paddock, and every morning he'd appear just after sunrise, walking quietly to the gate. He wouldn't call Ramu immediately. He'd just stand there, waiting. Usually, it didn't take long for Ramu to wander over. Each day, Ramu was led a little farther into the main enclosure, first to the mud wallow, then the pond, then the grassy meadow on the north side. The idea was to give him control over his own pace. And pace, it turned out, was one of the few things he truly took seriously. He didn't rush. Every new area was approached like a ceremony. A cautious step, a sniff of the ground, a pause, a longer pause, then movement again. I remember one morning when I arrived for my shift, I found him waist deep in the lake, his trunk draped lazily across the surface like a swimmer resting between strokes. A pair of egrets had landed nearby, waiting in the shallows. Ramu didn't move, just watched them. There was a stillness in that moment that I hadn't known elephants could possess. A kind of meditative peace. But not every moment was idyllic. Adjusting to his new surroundings brought challenges, especially when it came to his routine. After years of tightly controlled, punishing schedules in the circus, Ramu had developed a dependence on predictability: when to eat, when to sleep, where to walk. The open, unstructured environment of the zoo initially seemed to unsettle him. He would sometimes pace the perimeter of his night enclosure, even after the gates to the larger habitat were open. Other times, he would stand motionless for hours near the same log pile. Dr. Farida, the zoo's lead veterinarian, explained that such behaviors were common in animals recovering from long-term confinement. It was a sign of progress, she reminded us, that he was not acting out aggressively or refusing food. His body was safe, but his mind was still catching up. So we worked around him. Volunteers placed scented enrichment blocks in different areas of the habitat to encourage movement. We hid fruits in tires and hollow logs. We even recorded forest sounds from nearby sanctuaries and played them softly through hidden speakers to stimulate his senses. Slowly, something began to shift. He started taking longer walks. He began rolling in mud again, not just standing in it, but actively kicking and spraying himself. His favorite treat changed from bananas to sugarcane, and he developed a curious habit of peeling it with a precision that amused all of us. Then came the day that changed everything. About 5 months into his stay, we decided to begin a new phase of his adaptation: potential introduction to another elephant. The zoo had 2 other elephants at the time: Lakshmi, a 32-year-old rescued female from a logging camp, and Tara, a younger female who had been born in captivity. Unlike Ramu, both had spent time with other elephants in the past and had adjusted relatively well to sanctuary life. The plan wasn't to rush contact but to allow for sensory exposure first: scent, sound, and eventually sight. Their first visual introduction happened at the divider fence near the central grove. We positioned Ramu on one side and Lakshmi on the other, with enough distance to ensure neither felt threatened. We all watched from the viewing shelter. What happened next took us by surprise. Lakshmi approached the fence slowly and let out a short, low rumble. Ramu didn't respond at first. He stood stiff, ears twitching, eyes fixed on her. Then, just as we began debating whether to end the session, he took 3 slow steps forward. He extended his trunk across the space between them. She did the same. Their trunks touched, not for long, but long enough. Then he rumbled back. That was the first time I ever saw him initiate contact. We repeated these introductions every few days. Always supervised, always brief. Eventually, Tara was brought into the mix. She was more playful, curious, and at first a bit too enthusiastic for Ramu's comfort. But he didn't retreat. Instead, he seemed to tolerate her presence, even responding with small vocalizations when she chirped at him. By the end of the 2nd month, we opened a shared paddock with a careful exit path in case separation was needed. There was no drama, no tension, just elephants, slowly moving together through space. I remember a volunteer next to me whispering, "He's not just surviving now. He's living." That line stayed with me. The next major milestone came unexpectedly. One morning, a group of schoolchildren were on a guided tour along the observation trail near the elephant habitat. Ramu had been known to stay away from the fence when crowds gathered, likely an echo of his traumatic circus experience. But on this particular day, something was different. He walked over. He stood still, not pacing or flinching. The children grew quiet. One of them waved. Ramu raised his trunk, just slightly, and held it there. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't performance. It was acknowledgement. Afterward, a teacher came up to us, eyes misty. "They'll remember that for the rest of their lives," she said. And I believed her, because so would I. By the end of his first full year at the zoo, Ramu had become the heart of our sanctuary. Not a mascot, not a spectacle, but a presence, one that people came to see not because he did anything impressive, but because he simply was. We began hosting quiet hours near his habitat, no large groups, no loudspeakers, just time to observe. People would come and sit, sometimes in silence, sometimes asking questions about his story. Often, they would cry. Not because Ramu was sad, but because his journey illuminated something very human in all of us: the possibility of healing, even after unimaginable hurt. One day, Shankar told me something that has stayed with me ever since. He said, when Ramu first came to the rescue center, I used to wonder what he dreamed about. Probably chains, crowds, and pain. But now, I think he dreams about trees. And water. And maybe even friends. And it was true. Ramu had not only accepted his new life, he had begun to shape it. He had routines again, but ones of his own choosing. He had places he liked to nap, favorite trees he rubbed against, and a patch of earth where he sometimes just lay still under the stars. As the second year came to a close, we were already talking about the future, a larger, even more enriched habitat. Plans to bring in more rescued elephants. A sanctuary within a zoo, not just as a model, but a movement. And at the center of it all, there was Ramu. Not the old ghost of a circus elephant, but a being who had journeyed from survival to serenity. And in doing so, had quietly transformed every person who met him. But of course, life rarely moves in straight lines. And just when we thought Ramu's path had settled into peace, something unexpected happened, something that would take his story in a direction none of us saw coming. It was during the monsoon of Ramu's third year at the sanctuary that things began to shift again, not in a catastrophic way, at first, but in small, almost imperceptible ways that only those of us closest to him noticed. He had started spending more time alone again, not in the distant, withdrawn sense he used to exhibit, but in quiet solitude. He still greeted Shankar every morning, still rumbled softly when Lakshmi approached, still played tug-of-war with Tara using the jute ropes we hung from old trees. But his energy was different. Less exploratory, less curious. At first, we thought it was just the season. Monsoon often brought lethargy in the animals, the heavy rains, the muddy terrain. But something in his eyes told us otherwise. He had begun favoring his right hind leg more visibly. He lay down more often, and it took him longer to rise. Dr. Farida ordered a full checkup, which revealed early signs of arthritis, not uncommon in elephants his age, especially ones with his history of abuse and improper care. We adjusted immediately. Cushioned flooring in his shelter. Anti-inflammatory medications. Modified enrichment. Warm compresses. But we couldn't ignore the truth. Time was catching up. Still, Ramu carried on with his quiet strength. Visitors continued to come, not in loud, gawking crowds, but in respectful, intimate groups. People brought hand-painted signs, letters, and drawings. One child had painted Ramu walking under the stars, with the words, "You are not forgotten." We hung it in the volunteer station. Another elderly visitor who had grown up seeing circus elephants in chains wept as she watched him roam. "He's lived through everything," she whispered, "and still chooses peace." And then, one morning, something extraordinary happened, something we never expected. That week, we had been filming segments for an educational documentary on captive elephant rehabilitation. A small crew had been quietly documenting Ramu's daily life for a few months. Nothing intrusive, just a lens into his world. That morning, we'd placed a camera near a rocky outcrop where Ramu often paused to scratch himself. The crew had gone for a break, and only I and another volunteer were nearby. I remember it was unusually quiet, no wind, no sounds from the visitor trails. Ramu approached the rocks slowly. He stood for a while, then did something he'd never done before in front of us. He lay down, not to sleep, but fully on his side, his legs stretched out. And then he closed his eyes. It was a vulnerable posture, one rarely seen in captive elephants unless they feel completely safe. Shankar arrived quietly and stood nearby, saying nothing. After a while, Ramu opened his eyes, looked toward us, and let out a long, low exhale. That moment felt like a declaration. "I am home." We shared that video clip with sanctuaries across the world. It was used in trainings, lectures, advocacy campaigns. A still frame from that footage, Ramu lying in the grass, eyes closed, with a slight smile traced across his weathered face, became the image that would come to define him. But Ramu's story, like all stories, was not infinite. 6 months later, the arthritis worsened. His movement slowed dramatically. Some mornings, he wouldn't rise until mid-morning. He developed a low-grade fever that came and went. Blood work revealed signs of chronic kidney strain. The vet team doubled down on supportive care, but we all sensed the inevitable beginning to unfold. During those final weeks, Shankar rarely left his side. Neither did I. Ramu still responded to our voices, still accepted food from our hands, still rumbled when Tara came too close to his space. But the spark was fading, gently, quietly. One night, a heavy storm rolled over the sanctuary. I had just finished my shift when I got the call. Ramu had lain down in his favorite spot near the old neem tree, the same one he'd stood under when he first arrived. This time, he didn't get up. Shankar was already there, so was Dr. Farida. I rushed over in the rain, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, he was still breathing, slow, deep, rhythmic. His eyes were open but distant. I knelt beside him. For the first time, I touched his forehead, something I had never dared to do without invitation. His skin was rough, warm. I whispered to him, words I don't even remember now. He let out a final, long exhale. And then he was still. The rain continued. No thunder, just that soft, steady rain. We held a small ceremony the next morning, attended by zoo staff, volunteers, a few longtime visitors, and members of the animal welfare groups who had helped rescue him years ago. No grand speeches, just a circle of people who had been changed by knowing him. Ramu was buried beneath the grove he loved most. We planted a young banyan tree over the site, and a wooden plaque nearby reads, Ramu 45+ years. He suffered, he healed, he showed us who we could be. For weeks afterward, the sanctuary felt quieter. Not emptier, Ramu's presence lingered in every corner, but quieter, as if everything knew something sacred had passed through. But his story didn't end there. Inspired by Ramu, the zoo launched a permanent sanctuary program. We began taking in more rescued elephants, from temples, circuses, logging camps. A team of trainers traveled to villages to teach humane care. School programs were revamped to include a full module on elephant empathy, with Ramu's story at its center. And then there were the letters. Thousands of them. From children, adults, retired forest officers, even former circus workers. They wrote of guilt, of hope, of transformation. One letter simply said, I didn't believe animals had souls until I saw Ramu's eyes. As for me, I never stopped volunteering. Years have passed, but I still walk past that banyan tree most mornings. Sometimes I sit beneath it and read the letters we still receive. Visitors still ask about Ramu. Many never met him, but they feel they know him. And perhaps that's the most powerful thing about Ramu's journey. He came to us broken, unseen, and quietly endured more than any living being should. But he left having built a legacy, not of performance, but of resilience, grace, and quiet dignity. He didn't roar or rage. He simply lived, and by doing so, he reminded us what it means to heal. To begin again, to walk through pain into peace. That was Ramu's long journey. And all of us, those who knew him, and those who never met him but carry his story, we're still on it. Together.